A new level of ambition and excellence thrives at the Texas Tech System. A $2 billion higher education enterprise with 4 diverse and distinguished universities. Because from here, it's possible.
We are the family and the community that makes Walmart, Walmart. Whether it's stepping up in times of need or standing with our customers in times of calm and celebration, delivering on our promise to help them save money and live better every day. We are Walmart.
So I don't want to lose a minute before we start mulling the mind of Mueller. Unfortunately, Robert Swan Mueller III couldn't make it. I don't know. He said he's busy. We have, but the next best thing, which is 2 members of the House Intelligence Committee. That's Congressman Schiff right here, Congressman Castro.
Thank you.
We have Mieke Eoyang, who is a former member. We have Evan McMullin. No one needs any introduction. Former independent candidate for president of the United States and former CIA. And last, Michael Schmidt, the enemy of the people, right? Is that, do I have that right? Fantastic reporter for the New York Times. So we're coming at the subject of the enigma that is Robert Mueller, the black box investigation that, as far as I know, we really have no leaks. So we're not only reading tea leaves, we're sort of reading a black box. I don't think there's anything legible, directly legible from it. But we've been able to make some guesses. And of course, Congressman Schiff's investigation has tracked in tandem. You actually started before the Mueller investigation, before his appointment. So the first thing I want to do, just because you're so OG with this story, is for you to tell us about your investigation, what happened, and what that investigation is like now.
Well, okay. So you're not going to let any of the others talk then, because this may take some time. I'll try to give it to you in a nutshell. It started off the way you would hope a serious investigation would, with a bipartisan agreement that this would be the scope of the investigation. These are the issues that we would look at. Chairman Nunes and I made multiple public appearances where we committed that we would follow the facts wherever they lead. That we would be conducting many of the interviews in private so that witnesses would not be able to tailor their stories to what other people said, but that when the investigation was concluded, we would release the transcripts, and we would also try to do as many hearings in the open as we could to be transparent about the process. That persisted until March 20th of last year.
2017.
When James Comey testified publicly in our first open hearing that not only had there been a Clinton investigation, but there had been a Trump investigation. And that was the end of the bipartisan cooperation on our committee. And in fact, GOP members of our committee would later tell me they thought that hearing was an unmitigated disaster, which was interesting because there's no reason why that should have been a disaster for the GOP. Maybe it was a disaster for Donald Trump, but not for objective investigators, which is what we were supposed to be doing. And it was the very next day after that hearing that the chairman, in the middle of the night in what became known as the midnight run, left his staff, got into an Uber, went off to some undisclosed location to see documents that he would later claim in a press conference the very next day at the White House were so important and so revealing of a conspiracy by the Obama administration that he had immediately to go to the White House and present him with this information that he had obtained from this undisclosed location. But because this was a complete Keystone Coppers operation, we would learn within days that that secret location he had gone to in the middle of the night was the White House. And he was going to present to the White House what he had obtained from the White House. Well, I suspect what happened after the March 20th hearing is the White House had jumped down his throat and cooked up this plan. But of course, that completely derailed our committee. And even though the chairman, after that incident, was forced to step down for a period of time, he never ceded control of the committee. He continued to make behind the scenes all the decisions about what witnesses would come in and when they would come in, and what hearings would be done in public, what subpoenas would go out. And you'll see when the transcripts are ultimately released how often our colleagues acted as defense lawyers for Donald Trump rather than as objective investigators. And it's a terrible shame. It was a terrible shame for our committee, but it was a terrible disservice to the public as well. We learned a great deal nonetheless, often over the opposition and obstruction by the other side. But it was a disservice to the public. And if things change in the next 6 weeks, then we can get the committee back to the kind of mission that it was supposed to have.
I host a podcast called Trumpcast, and the only time I've ever choked up was I was reading the letter that you wrote saying that your investigation had to be severely contracted. That was 2018, right? So that, yeah.
About 6 months ago, the GOP said that they were done.
They were done, right?
They were done. Now, we've continued. And in fact, what happened 6 months ago was not so much the end of the investigation as the public revelation of what had been then going on behind the scenes, which is the Republicans had long since lost any interest in getting to the truth on Russia. They were only interested in investigating the investigators. So we were conducting two different investigations. The Republicans were investigating the FBI and the Department of Justice and anyone or anything that they thought would be of service to the president. And we were continuing to bring witnesses in to find out what did Russia do on social media and what did Russia do in terms of the hacking and dumping operation, and what efforts were made to obtain the emails from Russia or through the dark web. So we've continued those efforts, but obviously we're hamstrung by not having the subpoena power. Right.
Congressman Castro, I want to ask you just your felt experience of seeing your Republican colleagues go insane.
You put it so mildly.
I just mean, once they stopped wanting to get to the bottom, get to the truth of it, you and I were on a panel at TribFest last year, and things were pretty different. Yeah. And you could assume a measure of good faith. Chairman Nunes had sort of seemed to be sufficiently benched, but then he wasn't. And what were those, how did those conversations slide away from some agreed upon reality to the bad faith we see and the release the memo move from the Strzok investigation? What was that like with your colleagues?
Yeah, as Adam mentioned, there were dramatic moments and twists, so to speak, in the story, like the Midnight Run was certainly, I think, one of the first big ones. But beyond that, a lot of it was a slow burn. It was the fact that we brought in dozens of witnesses, but what was so amazing is that the committee didn't issue a single subpoena. Nothing for travel records or bank records or phone records. And, we would sit there and you knew that there were places, and we've even listed them out, right? I don't think we can talk about them here, but we've listed them out where we knew that if we were able to follow up with a subpoena and get some of these records, we might find information that was very valuable. There's one instance that has been talked about is when that June 16th Trump Tower meeting is set up, for example, Donald Trump Jr., in setting up that meeting, speaks with Emin Agarilov, a Russian national, and he's got a conversation with him, and I don't know if it was Rob Goldstone or two conversations with Emin, but sandwiched between those conversations is a call from a blocked number, right? And we'd also heard testimony that the president has a phone that has a blocked number. So there's an important question there as to who he spoke to in that short period of time in that window about this meeting, or whether the possibility that he spoke to his father and got his father's permission or talked to his father about it. So there's questions like that still linger, and to watch that and not be able to figure it out was incredibly frustrating. But even beyond that, just as an American, very disappointing that ultimately folks would put the job of protecting a president above the job of protecting the country.
Yep. You said slow burn, which brings to mind Slate's podcast about Watergate. You know, watching your Republican colleagues, we talked about this a little bit in advance, like, I mean, some of them, the ones who aren't body snatched or have eaten of the insane root, this must be agonizing. And, you know, on the Slow Burn podcast, we really learned that Republicans who ultimately were going to vote to impeach are, you know, were really torn. And I think, you know, we were talking about Jeff Flake on our panel earlier. We tend to think that everyone is just like a cold, calculating strategist right now. They're only partisan. But there must be some of your colleagues who are having questions and thinking about where they might stand on impeachment. Do you hear even whispers in the margins?
I mean, I think so. I think you have private conversations, quick conversations with people where they express reservations about the president. They express serious doubts about the president's ability to serve the country. But the question all along has been, who is willing to act upon that? And there have only been a few folks, both in the Senate and the House, that have actually taken action. And what's interesting is that a lot of the people, a lot of the Republicans, unfortunately, who have actually stepped up and challenged the president at different times, Bob Corker, Jeff Flake, Charlie Dent, who's a representative from Pennsylvania, a lot of those folks, if not most of them, are leaving. They're retiring.
Yeah.
In other words, rather than standing and fighting, they've decided to leave the Congress. And that's made it tougher because those people are gone.
Yeah.
They're leaving.
Can I just add something? And for those in the audience that haven't listened to Slow Burn, it's a phenomenal podcast,
Yes.
second only to your podcast.
Thank you.
You will see in that just the phenomenal similarities between what we went through during Watergate and today. Some striking. Both involve break-ins at the headquarters. Both involve their contingent of kooky conspiracy theorists. During Watergate, there was speculation that the CIA was the one that broke into the Watergate Hotel. You had your kooky characters, your Martha Mitchells, like our Carter Pages.
Yeah.
It's astounding. But there were two substantial differences. In Watergate, even though they had their cooperating witnesses as we do, and John Dean had this encyclopedic memory, none of that was enough ultimately, certainly in the Senate, until there were tapes.
Yep.
And that was one key difference between then and now. But the more significant difference, I'm convinced, is even if we had tapes, even if we had a tape of the lead up to the Trump Tower meeting, let's say that block call that Joaquin was mentioning, let's say we had a tape recording of that call.
Yeah.
And let's say that tape had father talking to Sonny and saying, I want you to take that meeting, I want you to get the goods.
Yeah.
I know this is against the law, but you know, what the hell?
And H.R. Haldeman is conferenced in. Yeah.
And go for it.
Yeah.
Even if we had that recording, Donald Trump has something that Richard Nixon never had. Donald Trump has Fox News. He has a whole media ecosystem with Fox and Breitbart and Daily Caller that allow his supporters to live in their own world. And his advocates, the Sean Hannitys of the world, would be out there saying that this tape was meaningless, that there's nothing wrong with it, and that everybody does it. And this, I think, is among the most cross-cutting challenges of all. It's, I think, why we have so few of our colleagues in the GOP who are willing to speak out in any way. And I don't know what we do about that problem, because we're not going to tell Fox what their content should be. We're not going to tell the Silicon Valley companies that curate the news, and this is how most Americans get their news now, what algorithms to use. But we now live in such different information worlds. And you can certainly see that in the Kavanaugh hearings, but that may be among the most cross-cutting problems of all.
Rick Wilson was here at TripFest last year and said the only thing that will change anything in this country is the untimely death of Rupert Murdoch. It seems timely, actually. Michael, you are not at Fox News, and in an info ecosystem that needs some maintenance itself, what's somewhat weird about this period for investigative journalists or even beat reporters is that we know that on the Russia story, there's a very good investigative journalist with subpoena power who can interview all the witnesses, and that's Mueller. And working in parallel to that are media techniques, are journalist techniques. Do you have your eye on how do you keep your eye on the Mueller investigation?
Well, the problem with keeping an eye on it is just how big it is and how many different parts of it there are. Because they sort of, all these things fall into different buckets. There's an obstruction bucket about the president's behavior in office, simply just his interactions with the Justice Department. There are questions of, context, all of these contexts, the Trump Tower meeting, why was that going on? The social media aspect, the financial aspect, the one that we have the least insight into. And the difficulty is in covering it is that each of the buckets are their own language and their own specific story. And to say, oh, I cover the Mueller investigation I really just cover one issue on the Mueller investigation, and that's obstruction. And I've thought that if I try to cover the entire thing, there's no way that I would be able to master all the languages of it. Yeah. And you see that with Rudy Giuliani when he goes out to try and talk about it, that these are a lot of different language, a lot of different things, and they're all complex, and there's a lot of nuance to them and such. And if you don't look at it that way, then you can get very confused.
On obstruction, well, I've seen now many times listed the different buckets that the Mueller investigation is exploring. How do we know that? Like, how do we? I mean, are we guessing from the witness list? Are we?
No, we're not. Okay. We're not guessing. We spend an enormous amount of time trying to figure out what Mueller is doing.
Yes.
Who he's talking to, what they're saying, what documents he has, his interactions with the White House. What has he really pushed people on? Don McGahn, the White House counsel, spent over 30 hours with Mueller, and Mueller has like over 1 million documents that the White House handed over, and has spoken to several White House lawyers and focused on these questions of obstruction. Like, what was the president's true intent? Why did he fire Comey? Was he really trying to end the Flynn investigation? And when you sort of step back from it and you look at the president himself, just the president, there is a lot more questions and evidence on the obstruction side than there are on the collusion side. There's questions about the Trump Tower meeting. There's questions about different things that he said on the campaign trail about hacking Russia. But there's, his relationship with Jeff Sessions, asking Jeff Sessions to unrecuse himself from the investigation, his efforts to fire Mueller, to get rid of Mueller. There's just a lot more in that bucket on the president than there is on anything else.
In the question of tapes, and I've heard Bob Woodward also say there aren't going to be tapes here, or if without tapes, we're nothing. But Lordy, there are tweets and emails. And one, at least, audio clip from an interview with Lester Holt that seemed to go to the question of obstruction. What do you do with all that stuff in public space? Well,
that's the thing, is that the president is oddly transparent.
Yes, yeah.
The president will tell you what he's thinking.
Yeah.
And it may be, factually off or, confusing, but he will tell you. And a lot of it's in the open. We wrote a story a few months ago about the tweets and about Mueller asking people about the tweets and how Mueller wants to ask Trump about them. Why is it that you wrote this thing, Comey, you better hope there's no tapes? Why does he continue did he continue and has continued to push Sessions? Is he trying to get Sessions to quit? Why is he trying to get Sessions to quit? Is it to install someone at the top of the Justice Department? So, and then the other thing is, in an interview in July of 2017, we went in to see him in the Oval Office, myself and two of my colleagues, and he says, I never would have made Jeff Sessions my Attorney General if I knew he was going to recuse himself. And, you know, he's telling you what he thinks. And it will be interesting in the end to see the impact of the public statements in, you know, whether, you know, how Mueller views them.
You know, in that, when he said that about Sessions and what he said to Lester Holt, I was thinking about this Russia thing when I fired Jim Comey. Those are the kind of things that an investigative reporter would work forever and maybe win a Pulitzer on, to get little clips like that. But you guys get them like you all. I mean, does your jaw drop when he says, I should never have made Sessions Attorney General?
I think we've lost our sense of news judgment and jaw dropping. I have no news judgment anymore. I'm not sure if things are a story or the biggest deal on the face of the earth. Sometimes they come and go very quickly, but that's true. If I said to you that I have found out that Donald Trump called in John Kelly and said, you know, let's try and get Sessions to unrecuse himself because I never would have made him my Attorney General, that wouldn't be a smoking gun, but that would be a pretty, I think, not necessarily game-changing, but important piece of the puzzle. And there's a ton of these that are just out in the public.
Yeah. Evan, on Trumpcast, we often treat them, we've had a lot of federal prosecutors, they treat the Mueller investigation or describe it as some kind of mob roll-up. That's, you know, for those of us in New York and who, you know, have now, like so many people, a new reverence for the Southern District, that's always interesting, and that conversation is interesting, and you get to use the pancake flipping GIF. Have you guys seen this? Whenever someone flips, like Manafort, it's like this pancake. And there's, and Cohen, but there, you know, Mueller made the FBI more of a counterintelligence organization, counterterrorism organization, and there's another way to see this investigation, especially if you imagine that at the top of it, I had a guest on Trumpcast say, Donald Trump, the American president, leader of the free world, is not the top. That's not who Mueller is after. And, you know, it was podcast silence, radio silence. I couldn't talk because I couldn't think of someone over the President of the United States. Like, this goes all the way to the top. You're looking at the Oval Office. But no, he thinks he's looking at the Kremlin. Do you agree? And also, how do you see this working as a counterintelligence operation, the Mueller investigation?
Yeah, well, I missed the GIF, the pancake GIF, but I'll have to
I'll send it to everyone.
Yeah. But, you know, look, I mean, I'm a former intelligence officer, so I tend to look at this as a counterintelligence investigation. It's true, whereas a prosecutor is going to look at it as a mob roll-up, as you say. But actually, the two are not at all mutually exclusive, especially when you're talking about the Russians. But I would say that, you know, I do believe that what the Russians did to our country in 2016 was the most significant intelligence operation ever conducted against this country, and it is also the most significant intelligence operation that the Russians have ever conducted. And I think that in retrospect, a lot of the things that we look at that Mike referenced and that you referenced before that happened out in the open, that we're trying to make sense of and connect the dots, you know, we're trying to connect the dots these days. I think in retrospect, we're going to look back and we're going to have a lot of clarity on what happened. And what happened was that the Russians carried out a very successful intelligence operation against the United States that included several hallmarks of intelligence operations: propaganda, covert influence. They had, you know, they leveraged their hacking capacity. They also had at least one person, I believe, who was cooperating with them, I think wittingly, and perhaps I'm talking about the president now, but also several others, whether it's Carter Page or Manafort especially. I mean, there are potentially some others. So the point is that, but the way, though, that the Russians compromise people is often through a variety of means, but one of them is through corrupt or illegal financial means. And I think there's more to learn in the public space about some of Trump's business dealings in the past. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of discussion about compromat and that being sort of the salacious details from the dossier about a hotel in Russia.
Wait, sorry, what was, I can't,
yeah,
I don't know what you're talking about.
Right, and
but that part's not interesting to anyone.
It is.
Is that the urine thing?
That's
the prostitutes and the thing in the mattress?
So uninteresting, and people tend to dismiss that as being so incredible. But I have to tell you, if you're a person of influence and you travel to Russia, if you're an American of influence and you travel to Russia, the norm is actually you should expect that you will be monitored in your hotel room, especially. And so that's the norm. And I know a lot of Americans who are just learning about this for the first time, don't come from an intelligence background. They see it as something that could only be imagined by Hollywood. No, this is the norm. But my point is just that it's not the only way the Russians compromise people. There are a variety of other ways that people can be compromised. And one of them is through financial activities in which the Russians leverage the Russian mafia. Russian intelligence leverages the Russian mafia. You cannot actually separate the two in order to compromise people over time. And if you launder money, Russian money, that's a compromising act. And if if the Russians ask you to push a certain message in the United States, whether you're a candidate or not, and you do it, that's a compromising act. If the Russians are helping you win an election and you realize it, even though maybe you didn't ask for it, but they're doing it and you realize it, and you've acknowledged in some way that you realize it, that's also compromising. But this is the nature of an intelligence operation, and I believe it is the nature of the intelligence operation of the Russians' interference in our elections in 2016.
Mieke, you are is a vice president for national security at Third Way, and we were just on a panel about Brett Kavanaugh, and so a lot of discussion of domestic issues up to and including Me Too. Obviously, the racism of the president, xenophobia of the president has been a big topic in the last 2 years. Some people see that as distinct from the national security question or the questions of Russian interference. My colleague Jamel Bouie just, I think coined this sort of like lasting or enduring epigram, which is that like racism is a national security issue. The fact of racism in this country has been meaningfully exploited by Russians, and the idea that the discourse is in shambles and that we are this close to riots on both sides is the wreckage of the hack of the undermining of democracy. Do you think that's true?
So I think that it's certainly one of Vladimir Putin's goals to set us against each other because we are fighting amongst ourselves. We can't come together as a nation to confront Russia and their rising influence in the world. So whether or not the things that have happened in this country exist, they're not the fault of Russia. We have these divisions among us already. We are a big, diverse society with a lot of different opinions. But what the Russians have been incredibly clever at doing is exploiting the cleavages in our own society, in using social media to set us against each other. And one of the things that we saw in some of the investigations into social media that I think is so fascinating is that the Russians were sponsoring Facebook groups on both sides, sending people to the exact same rallies, to scream at each other, to make it more difficult for us to find that common ground. And so when you think about what Putin's goals are on the world stage, right, the United States is their traditional enemy. They know when we're united and strong that we can check them in the world. And it is in his interest to make sure that we are divided amongst each other, but also divided among the US from our friends. And you see that in the way that President Trump has been interacting with our NATO allies, in the ways in which he cozies up to dictators. Now, whether or not that's his natural inclination, or this is something that has been suggested to him, I don't know that we know that yet. But it is certainly clear that Putin could not have picked a better president to help America destroy itself from within than putting Donald Trump in the Oval Office.
The Russian bots are alleged, like Molly McHugh, who Evan knows well, has pointed out that they're really gunning for a Kavanaugh confirmation now, and unsurprisingly. Not just they're pro-Trump, but also he's divisive, and to go back to Congress, there are figures in Congress, and I guess I just should say I'm thinking of Dana Rohrabacher, who are not just exponents of Russian bot hashtags like release the memo, but are potentially assets or agents themselves. Congressman Castro, like what's Dana Rohrabacher look like?
How did I get this question?
I don't know. I flipped a coin in my head.
No, you're right. I mean, one of the transcripts that was not released, that the committee this week, we just voted yesterday actually to release the transcripts from our investigation, and those should come out, I would think, sometime in the next few months. But there were 5 individual transcripts or interviews, and then a hearing that was not released. One of the transcripts that was not released was a Dana Rohrabacher transcript.
Yep, I saw that. Bill Browder, crusader on the subject, was very dismayed to see that.
Yeah, it's hard for me to explain Dana and what Dana is thinking. But yeah, obviously I disagree with his positions, and I can't explain to you exactly why he's so protective of Vladimir Putin, of Russia, defends essentially their interference in our 2016 elections, or actually doesn't fully admit it, it seems like.
He still says it could have been a 400-pound man.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I recall, well, he does a few things. From what I can tell, the last time I heard from him, he doesn't fully admit it, and he also deflects and says basically that the United States does the same type of thing around the world.
Right.
So he creates this equivalency. So basically insinuating that, well, everybody does that, and so somehow it's okay because we do bad stuff too. Yeah, so no, we obviously have deep disagreements.
Evan, there are figures like Rohrabacher who seem as though they might be hemmed in by that Kremlin bribe compromat, nexus. What is that? Do you think there are you said something about unwitting or witting co-conspirators. Do you think do you think Congress is filled with Russian assets? And do you think the president is a Russian agent?
Wow. That's a great question. Look, I will tell you that no, I do not think Congress is full of Russian assets at all. Rohrabacher has there are a lot of questions that he needs to answer. That's certainly a fair one, I think, for him and for others who know better. But I hope we don't think that Congress is full of Russian assets. That's just not the case. And most members of Congress, on both sides of the aisle, I do believe at least go to Congress hoping to serve their constituents. Certainly I have a lot of unhappiness or displeasure with the direction of the Republican Party and many Republicans in Congress these days, and question whether some of them are truly dedicated to serving their people over just trying to maintain their seats at all costs. But I would not say that they are Russian assets. As far as the president is concerned, I do believe that it is painfully obvious that the president is under heavy Russian influence. I think that's just clear. He defends Putin and Russia at every turn. He carries their message all the way, all the time. It's one of the few things he's consistent on. And the other thing is people say, well, was he aware of, people wonder, was he aware of the Russians' effort to hack and influence our election? I think we need to actually understand Donald Trump in a different way with regard to 2016. We need to understand him as a central piece in the Russian attack against our democracy, if not the centerpiece. Without Donald Trump, you would not have had that attack. He carried their message. He spoke every night or every other night at a rally that was carried by the cable networks. He used WikiLeaks stolen emails, Russian stolen emails distributed by WikiLeaks. He used that content. He put that out on our airwaves. Yes, on Facebook, the Russians reached 126 million people. Only 137 or so million Americans voted, but 126 million people saw Russian messages on that platform. But how many of us watched cable news during that period and heard Donald Trump pushing the Russian message? The way this works is that the Russians will go to a country and take advantage of these grievances, these differences that we all have, or that nations have, that countries have like ours, and weaknesses like racism, the existence of racism and other such things. They'll exploit those and create constituencies that after a while become so attractive to would-be leaders like Donald Trump who see those constituencies developing. And ultimately, those self-serving, opportunists, evil leaders decide that they will capitalize on those emerging destructive constituencies. And it becomes such an attractive political opportunity that they seize it. But that's the next step in the development of a Russian active measures effort that comes to fruition in the way this one did. And so the leader, in this case Donald Trump, decides that there's an opportunity here, and he takes advantage of that, carries the same message that's been sort of developed in this constituency, and that message further develops, further grows the constituency. He was a focal point. He was an integral piece, an integral element of the Russian attack against the country, not just someone who benefited from it.
On Rohrabacher.
Wait, you guys are glad that Trump was part of it? I know, you're happy to hear it said, and I am too. Michael.
Several years ago, the FBI, whose second top priority is counterintelligence, saw Russians meeting with Rohrabacher, and they got concerned about it, and they went to Rohrabacher, and they said, hey, just want to tell you that these may not be the type of folks that you think they are. And then they said to him, and the CDs that they're giving you that they say have music on them, they said, stop putting them in your laptop. So that's the sort of type of thing that the Bureau has looked at.
I wanted to add, I think Evan's analysis is spot on. And when I watched the President of the United States in that summit from hell, Helsinki, that's not an original line of mine, by the way.
No, that's good.
I had a few impressions. My first impression was he's not a Russian asset. Because if he were, the Russians would be saying, Donald, slow down.
Right.
Okay, slow down, you're going to give yourself away.
Yeah.
The Russians would be much more subtle about it. But I also could not avoid the overriding conviction that this is a man who fully believes he's compromised. Now, whether the Russians have a tape or not, I don't know. Whether the Russians have been laundering money through the Trump businesses, I don't know, but
You don't?
I don't know, but I think it is.
Know.
I think it is.
Yes.
I think it is negligent with our national security not to find out.
Yeah.
And this has to be a priority for us if we take back the House, to make sure that the Russians don't have. To make sure that the Russians don't have financial leverage over the President of the United States. But the other conviction I had watching Helsinki is that the message that the President delivered and the message that Putin walked away with was the Russians could intervene as they liked in these midterms, as long as it was on Donald Trump's side. This weak president, I'm sure Putin felt, this weak president will never call me out on it. I can do what I will in the midterms as long as it helps Donald Trump, and this weak president will never call me out on it. That is the opposite of deterrence. Now, the Russians may or may not escalate. They've never stopped intervening. They continue to intervene in the way Mieke was saying. They continue to set us against each other and never stopped. Whether they escalate beyond that, and we have seen indications, as Microsoft and others have revealed, of attempts to spearfish and hack and prepare the battlefield. The only thing staying their hand is the sense, I hope, that if they do escalate and if they get caught, and they will get caught, that the blowback in Congress will be so severe that the sanctions that were forced down the president's throat once will be nothing compared to the sanctions we will force down the president's throat if they intervene. That why jeopardize this perfect president from the Russian point of view? And he's a dream come true. I mean, he denigrates NATO, he weakens our transatlantic alliance, he makes common cause with autocrats, he criticizes Democrats. I think the big picture here in what Russia did, I think there are really two aspects of the big picture. The first is that what the Russians did, and Evan is exactly right, most successful Russian covert influence operation ever. But what they did to undermine our democracy is nothing compared to what this president is doing to undermine our democracy. The Russians can't cause us to distrust our own press. The Russians can't cause us to weaken the independence of our Justice Department or denigrate judges. Only we can do that to ourselves. And the other, I think, big picture here is that what the Russians did was not in isolation. It was new, it was unique, it was unprecedented in its scope in terms of Russian interference in our affairs, but the Russians have been doing this around the world. And it comes at a time when the autocrats are on the rise all over the world, in Poland, in Hungary, and the rise of the far right, in Austria, and Germany, and France, with Erdogan in Turkey, El-Sisi in Egypt, Duterte in the Philippines. There is a real challenge to the very idea of liberal democracy. This is a time when you need a president of the United States who is fighting for democracy, pushing back against this, and that we have a president making common cause with that is a disaster. Disaster for us and a bigger disaster for the rest of the world. And this is, I think, what we can't lose sight on as we get into the weeds of obstruction and conspiracy. The big picture is there's a real challenge globally to the very idea of liberal democracy. And of course, a challenge to our own democracy. I think the single most corrosive thing to our democracy, and we see this on display in the Kavanaugh hearings also, is this attack on the very idea that there's something called truth. With Giuliani and his truth isn't truth, and Kellyanne Conway with her alternate facts, and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who every day weaves fiction into some alternate reality. That is the most corrosive thing you can do in a democracy. And in that hearing we saw this week, of course, the truth was completely secondary for the GOP to confirmation. But too many people are prepared to say, well, you can have your facts and believe Dr. Ford, and we can have our facts and believe Kavanaugh. Well, they both can't be telling the truth. There is only one real set of facts, and that people either aren't willing to find out the answers or don't care what the answers are or seem content to accept their own alternate facts. That's a real threat to our democracy.
I want to go to questions, but Mieke, there seems to be consensus that that the Russian hack never stopped, Russian interference never stopped, and it's certainly, it was supposed to escalate, or maybe it's already reached peak flying, peak altitude before the midterms. Where are we right now? Sometimes I don't know if the analogy, there's some people, I think, that see the 2016 election as a kind of 9/11, like that we were attacked, and that we are still under siege, or somehow the internet or the information supply is still under siege. Tell us, yes.
I think that certainly the Russian attack, which is designed to get inside the process by which Americans decide who leads us, right? Like, it's our own very sovereignty that's at stake. They get inside that loop. That is the most serious attack that you could possibly have to a nation, right? They're trying to decide who leads us instead of we decide who leads us. The challenge that we see, and despite the good efforts of the members of Congress here, is that the current Congress doesn't seem interested in self-preservation to save the 2018 midterms. We've seen a number of bipartisan efforts try to come together to look at election security, to talk about how do we secure the election machines, how do we provide support to the states so that we can ensure that the voting is accurate. We've seen that legislation founder a number of times. We see tech companies trying to come to grips with the algorithmic manipulation of their platforms. Some of them more aggressively than others. Some of them, I think, are a little bit less haven't internalized as much the impact that they've had on the election, but some of them have. But we saw just this week, Facebook had a massive hack against its users where we see people still trying to get information. So it's very clear that the Russian effort, and there are many people trying to hack the systems, but the Russian effort is ongoing. We've had the Director of National Intelligence say, the light is blinking red, and I want to say to everyone in the audience, please go home and turn on two-factor authentication on every single system that you have, because we should all take our own security much more seriously.
I want to go to questions. I realize I'm remiss because I didn't give the hashtag TribFest, but if you tweet with that questions with that hashtag,
actually, it's Ask Trib.
Sorry.
So if you have any questions.
Totally wrong. Ask Trib. Release the memo.
If you have any.
But you could also, can they do it the old-fashioned way and come up to the mic, or no?
You can tweet hashtag Ask Trib, or you can text them to 512-692-0689.
All right, while you guys work on your hashtag, and it is my fault for not giving it.
I got some.
Oh, you do? Okay, go ahead.
And this can, any of y'all can take this one. What happens to the investigation if Rosenstein is fired or resigns?
Well, I can take a stab at it.
Okay.
Well, I think if he's fired, it becomes Exhibit B in the obstruction case of Bob Mueller, Exhibit A being the firing of James Comey. It also will have an impact in terms of whether he quits or whether he's fired, who replaces him. And that's key for a couple reasons that I think the public has little appreciation for, because Rosenstein is kind of an not well understood figure in all of this. What is his role exactly? People understand that he's overseeing the investigation, but what does that really mean? And what could someone else do who steps into his shoes? Well, there are two key responsibilities he has. One is to determine the scope of Mueller's investigation. Now, as I was mentioning, I think that investigation needs to include whether it's financial leverage that the Russians may have over the president. The president has tried to draw a red line and say, you can't look at that, Bob Mueller. We don't know whether Mueller's looking into that issue. There are conflicting signals about that. That's a decision that Rod Rosenstein makes. And with a new deputy AG, you could effectively cripple the Mueller investigation. You could tell Mueller privately, and this would not see the light of day, you will not look into this, you will not look into that, you'll wrap this up, that's the end of this investigative thread. So he determines the scope. The other thing that he does and will do is when Mueller finishes his report, it's unclear what happens to that report. That report will go to Rod Rosenstein, and Rod Rosenstein at the present will decide what happens to it. Does it get submitted to Congress? Is it made public, or is it buried? And someone who takes over that position can make that decision if they're the president's Roy Cohn, that report gets buried. I think that firing Rod Rosenstein or firing Mueller both amount to obstruction of justice. I think it leads us to a crisis. And people ask, well, what's the consequence of a constitutional crisis? And what makes it a crisis is there's no clear direction in the Constitution. And I think it will be paralyzing. What Joaquin and I tried to do in the last week of our session was to pass legislation that would protect Mueller, whoever the DAG, the Deputy Attorney General, is. Not wait until after there's a crisis, but of course we couldn't get the GOP to go along with that.
Yep. Oh, injuries? Yes, Evan.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I agree with Congressman Schiff's comments. But also, you know, I know we're here to talk about the Mueller investigation, and so I won't talk about something else for too long. But I just want to stress how important it is that we have, and I think the congressman would agree, more serious investigations in Congress. The Mueller investigation will look at criminal activities, potential criminal activities, and probably won't go too far beyond that. It may describe certain activities that are approaching those thresholds but don't quite get there, or don't get there in strong enough a way to be charged upon, for example. But this is really about, this is a question for America and for the American people about how to defend, as Mieke was saying, our ability to choose our own leaders, which is the whole ballgame. And so some of that, some of the activities of the Trump campaign and of Trump himself may not have tripped some sort of legal line that will result in charges in that particular case. I think there may be many of those, in fact. But these are still things that the American people, that we the people need to understand. And we need to be able to factor them into our decision-making about new laws and also about the selection of our leaders. And so what I just mean to say is that the Mueller investigation, even though I think he's doing a phenomenal job from what we know, and we'll know more down the road, but it will not be enough. There needs to be robust congressional investigations. Some of that happening in private, but much of it, I believe, happening in public. I don't think the existing committees have the existing resources, even in the Senate, where the investigation continues. They don't have the resources to do it the way it should be done. I don't know if there are two select committees in both chambers, or if it's a 9/11 type commission, or what it is, but there needs to be a legislative branch investigation inquiry much more robust than those that have so far existed, and hopefully that'll come after midterms.
Did you have one?
Yeah, real quick. I mean, there's a few things picking up where Evan was going with that, is that right now we're not doing enough to protect the country and protect our democracy. There's at least two things that we need to be doing. The first thing is election security. And there was a bipartisan bill that was moving forward in the Senate that the president squashed. But I was surprised to learn, I guess within the last 2 years, that there isn't a single federal law that requires even a basic level of cybersecurity protection for our election systems. And I can't find a state law, although there may be a state law out there. So Congress needs to move forward, and the states need to move forward quickly on that. The other part is that I believe that we need to move closer to what I would call a cyber NATO, basically, where we work with very close allies to be able to respond both defensively in a mutual way and also offensively in cyber. I'm not saying if they attack us on cyberspace, we're going to launch a missile, but be able to respond offensively in cyberspace if necessary, if pushed, beyond a certain point.
Next, from Ask Trib.
Mr. Schmidt, we have a few for you. I'm going to kind of clump them all together. In your estimation, what % of the information or evidence that the investigation has is known to the public? The story on Rod Rosenstein about wearing a wire could sink him at the DOJ. Do you think your paper played that correctly? And would you sit on information if it would expose something that could hurt the investigation?
So I don't, about how much Mueller has, and we don't know. My guess is a lot, because he's got tools that we just don't have in the power of subpoena and, search warrants and such. So I think he always knows a ton more, but we'll have to see. The question on Rosenstein is interesting. It's one that we've gotten. We reported about a little more than a week ago that Rosenstein had offered to wear a wire and had also discussed the 25th Amendment. And this was in May of 2017. So this is less than 4 months after Trump came into office. And there was some criticism of the story because folks said that by reporting it, it could give Trump a rationale to fire Rosenstein. So as we've gone back and tried to explain it, is that the reporting that we had sort of fell into two buckets. We had done months of reporting based on a lot of folks that we trusted that had access to this information that showed that Rosenstein had said this, and he said it in a serious way. And then in the other bucket was what we got in the last several hours of the reporting, which was a handout from the Justice Department in response to our questions from a person in the room who said he said it sarcastically. After hearing that, we went back and did more reporting, and we went back to these folks and said, did he say it sarcastically? No, and it had taken us many months to get this information out of these people. So we said, if it was a joke, why was it so difficult to get? So we had a factual determination to make. Do you look, how do you weight the different buckets? And then the question was whether to publish. And the folks that criticize our decision to publish are essentially saying that we should censor ourselves, that we should hold back. If we make a factual determination about something, and it could upset the president, it could force, the president may do something because of it, we should hold that back. And we're not going to be in that place. We're going to continue to follow the facts wherever they are, whether they're good for the president, bad for the president. We're just going to cover this story as much as we can without fear or favor. And I understand that some of the things you may see, in the Times don't comfort you and concern you and such, but we're going to continue to try and report the story.
Do any of you fear for your personal safety because of what you publish or your investigations?
I think this is a good question. I wanted to ask myself. I don't know. Evan?
No, I don't so much. I mean, I'm careful, but I've seen worse.
You're careful, like what?
I'm not. I'm careful. I'm careful. I don't go out at night. I live alone. No, I mean, I'm careful. I'm not too worried now. I mean, I've been in worse situations. I don't. I don't think I have much to worry about yet. This could be. I feel like I need to knock on wood. But the president has plenty of critics and plenty of people looking into his activities, and I don't think I should worry too much. But the question now makes me worry a little.
Michael, we all, in the attacks on the press, reporting on the attacks on the press in the press, we typically acquire this sang-froid of just I'm not afraid, I'm just doing my job. But every now and then, when that TV station was shot up, I do worry about our colleagues. But I don't know, I don't even understand if I've taken that in or not. What about you?
It's not helpful when he calls us the enemy of the people. It just isn't.
Yeah.
And that's a concern that we've expressed to the White House. And not only is that a problem for us, but if you're a foreign leader and you see the leader of the United States calling the press the enemy of the people, then you're probably more you're going to feel more comfortable going after the press and making the press a target in that country. So the impact is not just on us, but it's not a helpful thing to us at all.
Anyone else fear for their safety?
Depending on what's going on, and often what they're saying about me on Fox, I've got a number of death threats over the last year, and some of them are very specific. Calls the office saying, I'm going to put 3 bullets in the back of his head. This is the weapon I'm going to use. And I remember talking with Leader Pelosi about it on the House floor and saying, Leader, I'm getting a lot of death threats these days. And she looked at me and she said, oh, welcome to the club. And, it's a sad reality that I think for all of us, it's becoming a staple. I mean, the nature of the calls and the letters and the emails we get now looks nothing like it did a few years ago. And I don't know how we unwind that or unring that bell, but it's pretty ugly out there.
I think I saw you and Preet Bharara or someone comparing notes. And you've been attacked by the president, right? I mean, did he give you a nickname?
He's given me several nicknames.
Yeah.
And I have to say I'm a little upset because I had
threats.
my own nickname for a while. I was Sleazy Adam Schiff. And then, which had a nice ring to it. And then I became Little Adam Schiff, which I had to share with Bob Corker and I don't know who else. And it was like really a letdown.
Kim Jong-un, but then Kim Jong-un became good Kim Jong-un.
Right. You're right.
Yeah. He never talks about the height of Putin. I don't know why. I think that closes the case, by the way.
One of my colleagues, Mike Thompson, and he allowed me to dime him out on this. The first time I was attacked by the president on Twitter said, Adam, you ought to tweet back, Mr. President, when they go low, we go high, go screw yourself. only Mike used a stronger word than that. But I didn't think that would be in character for me.
Sadly, we have to wrap this up. It's an incredibly compelling conversation. I want to thank all my guests. This has been fantastic, and thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
It's really good.
Good to be with you.
I think we're headed off now.
It's fun joining you.